some of the places where the church has exploded have been in some of the most persecuted places in the world. I think it's just because when things get hard, you really don't have a choice to live in the middle. You're either on mission or you're out.
I think that is good. That is the point that we really wanted to pull throughout this whole book, is that it is your identity in Jesus that comes with a calling. And that calling is to live on mission. Not that you have to move to the inner city or overseas, even though God very well may be calling you there, but that you are called to live on mission where you are.
Welcome to Let's Talk About That, the podcast where we dive into conversations about life and share stories of faith. We're thrilled to be on this journey with you. Whether you're a longtime listener, someone who calls the Orchard home, or you're just stopping by, Let's Talk About That is your space to explore, reflect, and connect. Join us as we navigate the intricacies of faith, spiritual formation, and daily life as we invite guests to share their stories with us. So grab a cup of coffee, find a comfortable space, and let's do this together. This is Let's Talk About That, where you can be encouraged and inspired by God's work in our lives.
Well, we are back into Let's Talk About That, and I would love to tell you that this is a special episode with a surprise guest, but it's really not.
I was hoping you would at least say special guest.
No. I mean, not that you're not special, Matt, but you're just not a guest at this point.
Yeah.
You have had, quite a few appearances on the pod, especially since our host AJ left us, and I've kind of had to shift into the host role. That meant you've kind of shifted in. You've even hosted your own podcast, I guess, with the Coaches podcast, which was good, by the way.
Well, I appreciate it. I would say, self-awareness, we agree, right? Everybody in the world should take a self-awareness class.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So self-awareness, I know that I'm probably not the top option to host, probably not at the top of my strengths. So, and I'm glad to default to someone else to host typically.
Look, I'm going to be honest. AJ was probably the best podcast host that any of us, have ever had seen, experienced in person. Like he was really good at the podcast.
Self-awareness, that was one of his strengths.
It was. And it was kind of like out of nowhere strength.
Yeah. Energy and randomness go a long way.
I guess.
And then being able to just hit it back and get serious real quick. So, yeah.
It was just like, I remember we listened to the first episode and we were like, wow, AJ was really good at hosting that.
Yeah.
He did a lot better than we expected.
Yeah.
So, hey, we missed our boy, but we are here keeping it going. And we've had some good conversations, and most of those conversations have revolved around people coming in and just kind of sharing their stories of faith and what that has looked like, from our coaches' stories to stories of couples to last week meeting our newest pastor on staff, Robert, just really sharing stories. That's not exactly what this podcast will be, even though the Pennington story got a new chapter since the last time you've been on the podcast.
Chapters, plural, I think. If I sound tired, I am tired. One of the chapters that we, opened was May 13th. So a little over a month ago, we welcomed our third child into the world, a little boy named Maddox. And so I know people in Live Oak, they got to see him personally this past Sunday.
He made his appearance.
That was his first appearance. So that was good. Nothing burned down. He didn't scream the whole time. So that was a big question mark that was answered for us. So that's probably the biggest thing. I will say this. I've said this repeatedly to a couple people who are in this boat. I have a newfound respect for people who have 3 or more kids.
Yeah.
Because everybody's like, how's it going? And I'm not joking when I say we're surviving, because that's what it feels like right now for whatever reason. Yeah, maybe I'm just older and I didn't.
It's the move from man to zone.
Yeah, that's a real thing. I told somebody this the other day, the biggest thing that I've noticed, because this is not my forte, this is not who I am as a person, is when you have 3 and one of them is constantly having to be held because you can't just sit them down. I don't know, 3 months, 4 months, whenever they can sit up, you can at least sit them down and they just kind of sit there. At this point, it's like literally all hands on deck, because one of us is holding him most of the time unless he's sleeping and you can put him down. what I found is I'm parenting with my voice a whole lot more.
Yeah.
I can't just get up and, hey, let's sit down. Let's talk about this real quick. But like, I'm giving you the look that says if we don't figure this out real quick, then we can do some other things, right? Well, you can't do that when you have a baby in your hands. You know, I'm screaming from across the room, or I'm saying, hey, can you go get this done or do this or grab that? Or, you know, like our 6-year-old, bless her heart, the last couple of weeks have been probably hard for her because it's like, hey, can you go get
You're the new babysitter.
I mean, literally,
Yeah.
you know, she's holding the baby at times. She's feeding him a bottle at times. She's like, hey, can you just hold him so I can go to the bathroom? You know, she's taking on some responsibilities.
But I bet she's, you know, liking that.
The thing that's crazy is you always hear about, oh, the middle child is this way and the oldest child is this way, the baby's this way. And like, I'm seeing that play out in real time. And I'm like, I know why the first child is the CEO, because from 6 years old on, they've been tasked with responsibilities and held to a standard. And you have to do this, this, and this.
They're the boss.
You know,
Yeah,
like,
sure.
It's so funny. This morning, as we record this morning, Madeline, who's our oldest, she looks at me and she says, Daddy, what's my job today? And I'm like, well, right now it's to hold your brother and feed him this bottle so I can get dressed, you know? But, you know, you just see that it's an interesting dynamic just to kind of see all that. But it's been survival mode, but we're surviving.
Well, you know, they say that once you go to 3, 4 is no problem.
Well, we are probably never going to find out.
That's not on the Pennington radar.
That is not on the radar.
All right, fair enough. But so if you see Matt around, see Kelly around, they look a little bit more tired than usual. You just pat them on the back and say, "Hey, hang in there."
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, you got this. You got
Please,
this.
yeah.
All right. So what we're actually going to talk about in the podcast today is something that we haven't had a chance to do in a while, since it's been, you know, bringing in guests, and I've enjoyed it. It's great. But today, you know, Matt and I sitting down, we are just going to kind of go back and almost post-mortem the series that we just finished. Because I think it was a good series. It was a series that could have been a whole lot longer, because we went through the book of Colossians in 4 weeks and 4 chapters, a chapter a week, but we did not.
Yeah, I mean, on the outset, it seems like, 4 weeks, 4 chapters, perfect. Let's do a chapter a week. Well, then you start reading the chapters and you're like, I mean, I know in our communicators meetings, we're looking around like, I mean, I know it's only 10 verses, but which ones we're going to have to cut out to be, you know, within the time of 35 minutes. You know,
Yeah, how are you going to get all of this in? Answer, you're not.
You're not. And, you know, that's part of, I think, pastoring. What you have to do is you have to do the legwork. You have to do the, read the entire book. You have to read the entire thing, kind of boil it all down, and be able to communicate. And sometimes, I mean, a lot of pastoring is summarizing. You know, you have to summarize.
Really? Yeah.
And I think that's part of the legwork of pastoring is, you know, one of my pet peeves is, and this maybe catches somebody off guard or the wrong way. I don't mean it that way. One of my biggest
But
pet
you're tired and
peeves,
you don't care.
Yeah, that's a real thing, by the way. That is a real thing. One of my biggest pet peeves is I hear guys preach, and everybody has their own style. I'm not critiquing them as a pastor. Pastoring is so much more than how you communicate. Let's just clear the air on that.
Absolutely.
But it's almost like they're walking you through their own personal Bible study. And again, I know that sounds terrible to be like, well, what's wrong with that? I think the hard work of communicating is you do the personal Bible study, you do the research, you do all of that, and then you condense it down, you boil it down so that when you do communicate it, you're giving the people the essence of what it is without having to walk through the nitty-gritty details, because some of those details aren't necessarily the main point.
Yeah, for sure.
And it eats away at time and things. And so sometimes I don't know. That's just me personally.
No,
So
I completely agree with that.
Yeah. My take has always been, I want to do all the hard work. I want to do the legwork. I want to do the hard part of how do you summarize this down so that I can walk through intentionally the parts that are really, really essential, but maybe I can summarize the parts that are less essential to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think, you know, the art of preaching is just that. It's an art. Preaching is not Bible study, like you said. Preaching is also not commentary. I think we have to be very careful that we do not make our preaching just a running commentary. There are a lot of excellent commentaries out there that you can go through that will verse by verse explain the text for you. Preaching is drawing out the point of the text and making it relevant and applicable to the lives of the people.
And communicating it clearly.
Yeah.
And sometimes, this is what I mean. All of God's word is essential. Don't mishear what I'm saying. But sometimes when you are speaking clearly, you detract from clarity when you get lost in this commentary of, is it this Greek meaning or this Greek, you know what I mean?
That's right.
Is that essential? Yes, but you can do that in your own time so that you can clearly say this is what it means in real time.
Well, and I think part of that is complicated by the fact that when we say preaching starts with drawing out the point of the text, that is not as simple as it sounds in that the text is often layered.
Yeah. There
are multiple themes that run through all of Scripture. You have to take into context the original context of the audience, our current context today. And in one paragraph, there may be 4 or 5 points that you can bring out of the text. Right. And so that's what we mean when we say, okay, what point of the text are we bringing out today? And to do that, you have to be able to not just understand the text, but understand the context that you're preaching in.
Yeah.
Understand your people, understand your community. Right. And John Stott was a English pastor in the modern times. He's not as old as Spurgeon or whatever, but he's probably like 60s, 70s kind of guy. He said that preaching is really walking between two worlds and connecting them.
I know you say a lot when we talk about relationships, right? That for a guy, you speak with a blue microphone, but she hears with pink earphones or headphones, right?
Yeah.
And vice versa. And so the idea you're presenting is, even though you're saying it, doesn't mean that it's being heard the right way.
That's right.
And so if you take that same concept, then the biblical authors are using a 2,000-year-old microphone and you're listening in wireless AirPods.
Yeah.
And so you have to figure out, how are these two things compatible, not because they're not compatible, but because the signals are different, the things are different. And so you have to do the hard work in between.
One way that we've said it in the past is that that Scripture was written for you. It just wasn't written to you.
Yeah.
It was written to the Colossian church, the church here in Colossae that lived in Paul's lifetime. And what we did is we said, okay, this is how this letter written to this church 2,000 years ago connects to your life today. And the idea was that just like they were called, we are called still to live on mission.
Yeah.
To live really as informal missionaries. And that was the idea that we kept hammering on. And really, it's an idea that has, I think, taken root in the minds of the people here at the Orchard. I know it has for sure among our staff and leaders. So I'm curious, Matt, in what ways have you seen the idea of informal missionary really kind of take roots in our church consciousness?
So I'll tell you this. I had a conversation yesterday. Yesterday evening, we went up to the rec fields in Live Oak, and we were hitting some softballs because we're getting ready for our yearly softball team.
You were practicing.
Yeah, something like that. I was exercising. That's what I was doing. I was joking with my wife and said, this is the only exercise I get all week. And by exercise, I mean I swing a bat 20 times. Yeah. So, but no, we were out there, and one of the guys from the church, because a lot of the guys from the church are on the team, and that's kind of why we do it, just to be able to connect and to have some fun too. And one of the guys said, I've been listening, and for him, that meant he applied for a job where he went from working remote to, if he gets this job, he'll be around people.
Okay. And
it just struck me there. And I'm like, hey, this is like, this guy is saying, this is what it looks like. If I follow Jesus, then it may look like I change jobs because I can have influence with the real people around me versus, working remote. Now, he said, I don't know, it's a pay cut, all that kind of stuff that he has to pray through and filter through. You got to get
figure that stuff out.
But like the point was, I applied for a job in person because I'm kind of listening and tracking, and to be a follower of Jesus, then maybe I need to be around people and not work remote. Does that mean working remote is evil? No. But for him, as God moves in the lives of people through his word, then maybe for him, it's like, hey, this is what I want you to do because I have purpose for you to live this way in and around people. So I think it was just in that moment, like, this is what it looks like. Does that mean it looks like that for everybody? No, but it looks like wrestling with the idea of, because of who Jesus is, because of who I am as a follower of Jesus, this may look like this in my life. And the point is, when people gravitate to this idea of living as an informal missionary, it means like weighing and evaluating, where am I? What am I doing? Maybe I'm already in a position where I'm around people all the time. It just looks like now I'm going to be intentional in my conversations,
It really is, at the bare minimum, a filter that you have to run every decision through.
Absolutely.
And I think it can be far more than that, but at the minimum, it is, how is this decision going to impact my ability to impact lostness?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is its perspective, right?
Yeah.
When this phrase, informal missionary, we've talked about it. This is not a new idea. The terminology may be new. We've packaged it in a way that we hope kind of
Spurgeon
sticks in
said
people's
it
minds.
100 years ago, right?
Right.
Every Christian is either a missionary or an imposter. He said, you're a missionary.
Yeah, the idea itself is 2,000 years old. It's just we're trying to say it in a way that makes sense to people, that when they hear it, they immediately can tie back to, oh, this is what that means, that you don't have to look up a dictionary and say, oh, what'd that word mean again? Like, we try to package it in a way that's very obvious of, you're a missionary, but you don't draw a paycheck from IMB. That's what it means.
That's right.
It means that you can work at Nutrient and be a missionary. You can work at the local school board office and be a missionary. Like, that's the whole point, is you are a missionary by definition because you follow Jesus. You have a message because you follow Jesus, and therefore you just go, and because you follow Jesus, it changes how you live your life. You may be employed by X, Y, or Z, but you live for Jesus.
And that's really, I think, the point of what we were bringing out of Colossians, because Paul does not use the term on mission or missionary. Informal missionary inside of the book of Colossians, that letter to the church. But he writes the letter to say, hey, we've never met, but I know about you. I've heard of you, and I want to share a couple of things.
Yeah.
And the primary thing is, your identity is in Christ, and that identity comes with a calling.
Absolutely. And the context is, right, there's this Colossian heresy going on, really kind of mysterious to us because we're just getting tidbits from what Paul says. But Paul hears about this church. He's never been there. He didn't plant this church. Other people living on mission did, by the way, right? Because other people not named Paul were living for Jesus, this church was planted and started and established.
Yeah, kind of wild to think, hey, the church planter did not plant the church. You know why? Because Christians did this everywhere they went.
Exactly. And so I think it's a good case study there in and of itself, that this is what it looks like to live on mission. But secondly, it's Paul also knows, hey, because of your situation, you live in a somewhat hostile environment because you're being pushed and pulled in many different directions, saying, oh, yeah, you have Jesus, but you also need to worship the angels. Oh, you have Jesus, but you also need to make sure you're keeping this feast and this festival.
Well, that idea of Jesus plus something.
Exactly.
Right? We're not exactly sure what the plus something was, but there was definitely a plus.
Yeah, and there may be layers to the something, but the point is, Paul, in response to what's going on in this church, he simply reduces it back down to, this is what it means to follow Jesus. And I think that's the essence of living on mission. It's really nothing different than, this is what it means to follow Jesus. When you follow Jesus, you will inevitably find yourself on mission. And I think that's the tie-in to our series, is because Paul is simply saying, I know your condition, I know your environment, I've heard of your faith. Now, just be reminded, this is who Jesus is and this is who you are in Jesus, and that will help you in your current situation. And so for us, the parallel to living on mission is, this is who Jesus is, this is who you are in Jesus, and so therefore, this is what it looks like to live on mission.
Yeah, I think, something that strikes me looking back at this series as a whole, it's specifically because of where we ended last week. Because Paul mentioned in the text in chapter 4 Sunday, pray for him while he was in chains, right? Not that he would get out of prison, but that a door would be opened for the word. And, just the thought that I have is, Paul had not met these people. He did not plant this church. But we have this letter that has made its way through history in the inspired scriptures, and we just spent a month talking about it at the Orchard Community Church in North Central Florida. That would not have happened, most likely, had Paul never been arrested and imprisoned.
Yeah.
Because so many of Paul's writings, not just Colossians, but so many of his letters came while he was in prison.
Yeah.
And, you know, I know this is almost like a little rabbit trail, but it just hit me when you were saying all that, Matt, that the way that the Christian life works hasn't really changed from Paul's day to ours, because sometimes God has to put us in situations that slow us down, that make us uncomfortable, that, you know, whatever, so that his plan and his purpose can continue to go forward.
Yeah. So I was listening on the way over here today. I was actually listening through on audio Revelation. I just started on Revelation 1, you know,
like just the text.
Yeah, like the book of Revelation in the Bible.
Well, I mean, I got that. I'm
no,
like
I'm
a
saying
sermon
like,
or the book.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Okay,
like the actual book of the Bible. And I was just in one. It's a 30-minute drive, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to listen. And some of that's contingent on things that are happening in the world, just kind of like reading and refreshing myself, because you're bound to get questions.
What would you be referring to, Matt?
Yeah,
anything?
Different podcast,
yeah,
probably.
Fair enough.
Who knows? A lot can happen in 24 hours.
You might be listening to this like a month from now, and it'd be something totally different.
Yeah. But anyway, I was listening to that, and one of the things that is mentioned in Revelation, I don't remember if John said it or if it's part of the vision or whatever, but the point was, some of you will be attacked, basically, that Satan will persecute you and test you or try, tempt you or whatever. But the connection was by putting you in prison. And it's one of the letters to the churches. That's what it was. I think Sardis or maybe something like that. But the point was, the connection was at the same time that part of Satan's attack could look like you being in prison. And the encouragement was, but it's not going to last forever, remain faithful, etc. And I think that's part of what you're saying is, yes, we wouldn't even have this if Paul wasn't in prison.
That's right.
But also, because Paul was on mission, he faced opposition. Yeah. Like Paul found himself in prison because of, and we're using the world systems, but because when Paul is going around from city to city in the Roman Empire preaching Jesus is Lord, at some point the Romans get word of this and they're like, oh, whoa, we have a problem on our hands. Yeah. Because I don't know who Jesus is, but Caesar is Lord. And so Paul is preaching a message that in the eyes of the Romans is directly undermining who they are as an empire.
Yeah, so that reminds me, we were at kids camp this last week, and sometimes...
So you know a thing about being tired.
Yeah, I get it. My back still gets it. Sometimes, man, I'm just an idiot and can't help it. Sometimes, you know, we're sitting there at kids camp, and the camp pastor is talking about Jesus was arrested for crimes he never committed, you know, and stuff like that, put on trial for, you know, found guilty of crimes he never committed. And immediately, without thinking about it, I go, I disagree. And Mary Beth is sitting next to me. She just like looks over at me. And what I'm thinking is, no, Jesus did not sin, but claiming lordship and divinity and authority was a crime in the Roman Empire. And so when Paul here is preaching that Jesus is Lord, that's not a sin. That's but it was a crime.
Yeah.
It really, and I think that we're like, oh, he was thrown in jail just because he was being persecuted. Yes, but his faithful gospel witness made him an enemy of the state by the letter of the law.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's something I think we miss sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, and think about it this way. At one point in Acts, in the book of Acts ends somewhat like in a cliffhanger. You know, there's debates on, is it because Paul died or is it because he got let off or whatever? Paul appeals to Caesar. As a Roman citizen, he had a right, and to escape with his life and not be massacred by the Jews who were mad at him, at one point, he appeals to Caesar.
Take me to Rome.
And so think about it in this way. At some point, let's say Paul actually makes it to Caesar, and most people agree that he ends up in Rome and gives this high-level defense.
Yeah.
Hey, Paul, why are you here? I'm here because I was preaching the gospel. What's the gospel? Well, quite simply, it's that Jesus is Lord. And imagine, like, you appeal to Caesar, and you are directly flying in the face of Caesar. At this point, you're saying, hold on, Paul.
Well, we think world leaders today have egos, and no doubt they do. Which, by the way, best Facebook post I read yesterday. A girl I went to high school with said, "I don't know why these presidents just can't meet up and fight because I don't know why they have to drag us into it." But no doubt, world leaders today have egos, and yet Caesar was like, "Oh no, I'm God."
I mean, read about some of the Caesars. You know, Nero has a long list of crazy. And there was no checks and balances back in those days, because if the people in the Senate were going to check and balance you, you would just kill them. Or they would kill you.
The checks and balances were, Julius Caesar, being stabbed by the entire Senate. Yeah.
The sword was your checks and balances. But the point is, like, Paul appeals to Caesar himself as a Roman citizen. He has the right to do so. And yet, if he appears before Caesar, what is he going to say? He's going to say, Jesus is Lord and not you. It's a dead end road, so to speak. But like, Paul is on trial for the message that he bears. And that message will essentially cost him his life because it flies in the face of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And so to me, that was one of the big takeaways from chapter 4, was when Paul asked for those prayers, he seems to acknowledge, hey, the message that I have is probably going to get me killed. So pray for me that I will stay on mission in hard times.
Yeah. I'm not praying that you get me out of here. Just help me stay focused, that doors will be open while I'm here. Because, and this is one of the things, I think I said it kind of like this, but being on mission is not dependent on what's going on around us.
No.
Like, our circumstances do not change that call to mission. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the most dangerous circumstances to deter us from mission are not hard times, but comfortable times.
Absolutely. I mean, look at the church across history. Some of the places where the church has exploded have been in some of the most persecuted places in the world.
That's right. What was one of the quotes from the early church is that the foundation of the church is built on the blood of the martyrs.
Blood of the martyrs, yeah. I think it's just because when things get hard, you really don't have a choice to live in the middle. You're either on mission or you're out.
Yeah, you're either a missionary or an imposter. That's right. Yeah, so I think that is good. That is the point that we really wanted to pull throughout this whole book, is that it is your identity in Jesus that comes with a calling. And that calling is to live on mission. Not that you have to move to the inner city or overseas, even though God very well may be calling you there, but that you are called to live on mission where you are. You're not called to live on mission by yourself. You are empowered by the Holy Spirit to live on mission. You have the authority of Jesus himself that sends you on mission. You're carrying his message and his power. But that was true for them. It's true for us. And I think that it goes back to what you said with the preaching thing, right? It is that it's not just unpacking the text, it's connecting it to our world today, which I think is one of the challenges when we go through book studies like we just did. Mm-hmm. Because book studies, in my experience, preaching them and sitting under them, they can really easily just become a running commentary, just like a Bible study. So let's kind of maybe go meta for just a minute and talk a little bit about how we preach at the Orchard and how we determine what we preach, like the types of series, because we do book series, we do doctrinal series, and then we do very practical series. Mm-hmm. What do you see? What's the value of us doing a book study, maybe more than a more topical, doctrinal, or practical study?
Just to be quite frank, the value of the book study is the content's already there. I mean, you're not wondering, hey, what am I preaching, next week, or how does this fit into the series, or what topics do we need to address in this series? I mean, let's use Colossians, right? Colossians 2, like Paul says, hey, here's what I'm saying to you. And so for us in week 2, it's like, hey, here's the content. Now you figure out the relevance of that as far as, okay, living on mission. Because Paul's not writing this letter because he's preaching a 4-week series titled On Mission.
That's right.
He's writing a letter because he has a purpose for that. But the value of the book study is you don't really have to wonder about content. And so...
Well, hot take. And this is going to make some people mad. You know the meme of the guy from the Tangled movie with all the swords in his throat? It's like, what opinion gets you like that? Yeah, well, here's my opinion that gets me like this. I think that some pastors go through book studies not because it's actually, quote, more biblical or the right way to preach, but because it's easier for them to have their content already laid out, and all they got to do is basically recite commentary.
Yeah, I mean, I don't.
And that's probably a hot take. Way. I've been there, by the way. So that's not just a random shot across the bow.
Yeah. So I think we should paint a picture of the opposite of book study. So then some people may be able to understand exactly what you just said. Because I agree that sometimes it's just like, without any really thought or prayer or consideration, it's kind of like, all right, I'm in Matthew, so we're going to be in Mark next because that's the next page, versus, let me just say this. So when I went to school, and Chip knows this because this is his background, there's a lot of different traditions and denominations out there, and different denominations kind of have their own style, I guess, or preference when it comes to how you preach, methodology, stuff like that. And so I think our traditions would favor the verse by verse book study. They call it exegesis, which sometimes can be misleading. But other traditions, are, I guess there's more freedom, but there's some dangers with that, right? So,
well, I grew up what's weird is I grew up in some different type of denominations, and I would say by and large, in the last 20 to 30 years of the more Southern Baptist tradition, the favor has fallen upon you need to preach book by book through the Bible, chapter by chapter. I grew up in a non-denominational charismatic church where, it was hey, this is what, the Lord led me to preach this week. Even under one particular pastor, hey, Lord, didn't even lead me to preach this week. So all we're going to do is sing. And I think those are two vastly different models. That's kind of that is an extreme of what you're talking about.
Yeah. So if you're listening at home, and I know sometimes we take it for granted because we went to school and debated all this stuff and blah, blah, blah. If you're sitting at home and you're like, dude, this is all brand new to me, I don't even know what you're talking about. Basically, the dichotomy is in the world of preaching is you have what's called exegetical, which means that you loosely, well, let me say this. People define it different ways. What it means is basically going verse by verse. You're pulling out of the text what is their kind of methodology and thought. The flip side of that is topical, and topical is you just preach on a certain topic. And so there's pros and cons, we would say, to both of those. I think there's value in both of those, and that's kind of what we're talking about. I will say this, the biggest knock from the exegetical people on the topical is that you're just using scripture to say what you want to say, which is a very real thing that happens all over TikTok and Facebook and Instagram.
And it's the opposite of exegesis, which is eisegesis.
Right.
And so X out, right? X is to bring out of the text the point. Eis means in, E-I-S. Eis means in.
Right.
That means we read into the text our point. And that's what they're saying is when you just topically preach, you're reading your point into the text. And anyway, I'll let you finish up, then I'll kind of, share some of my thoughts on that too.
So I think both of us come from a tradition, and probably in school you were probably encouraged to be exegetical verse by verse, which lends itself to book study. Like, hey, we start in Matthew chapter 1 and we finish Matthew 28, and then we go to a different book and we're going to go through the entire book, right? That's kind of the point. I think those people, their goal is probably good. It's probably good intentions to say, hey, we need to make sure that we are hearing from God. We need to make sure that we are taking out of what God intended us to get out of his word, that God's the author. He gets to control the meaning. We have to discover the meaning and pull it out and then communicate it to our people. I think it's a safeguard against some topical preaching that has been abused, has been misused, has been guys with a microphone who get up and they have an agenda and they're going to start in this verse and then they're going to end nowhere near that verse just to communicate their own opinions and biases and thoughts and all of that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the idea behind it. I think the safeguard is go verse by verse, probably why we were encouraged to go that route. However, this is the ironic thing to me. I sat in classes and I was encouraged in this way, and I understand the sentiment behind it. The thing that struck me, though, was in the back of my head, I was never bold enough to say this to my professor because I realized they're probably smarter than me and they controlled my grades. But I was always struck by the reality of, okay, you want to go verse by verse, book by book, but every letter in the New Testament was written with certain circumstances in mind. Paul wrote a letter because he wanted to address this going on in this church. Read through 1 Corinthians. There's a whole list of topics and stuff that's probably not very good. And Paul wrote that letter because he wanted to address these specific topics. And that's why 1 Corinthians reads different than Galatians, because the circumstances are different in those two churches and those two regions. Yes, there's overlap because that's the doctrine. That's the who Jesus is. That's the who you are in Jesus. Those are the principles that anchor you to it all. But Paul writes and he addresses things in 1 Corinthians that he doesn't even talk about in Galatians.
That's right.
And so for me, it was always odd to think, well, I have to go verse by verse. I have to go exegetically. I can never be topical. And I'm thinking, but I mean, most of the New Testament is topical. You know, it's addressing things that were relevant in that culture. And so I think for us, the blend for me is I think topical is helpful when you can address things that are happening in your world. Because some of the most relevant things that your people are dealing with and trying to wrestle with are the things that are happening on the evening news, are the things that are happening in the Middle East. How do I think about this? Is this the book of Revelation playing out? And so I think there's a place for topical because topical is relevant, not because it's like, oh, relevant and you're going to attract a massive crowd just so you can count it on your roll. No, relevant as like people are wrestling. How do I think about these issues?
Why is this so important?
Exactly.
So this is kind of my take on the whole thing because, Matt alluded to this. It's easy in some circles to catch shade if you're not preaching verse by verse, book by book through the Bible because, well, you're not really, preaching the Bible. You're just tickling ears, telling people what they want to hear.
The criticism is you're watering it down. You don't want to preach the hard things.
That's right.
So you're getting to pick and choose what you preach.
Which, to be fair, the biggest argument for book by book, verse by verse preaching, which is why we do it occasionally. Well, I won't even say occasionally. Why we do it regularly. Like we make sure we do it at least twice a year. Mm-hmm. Why we do it regularly is because it does force us to hit some text and verses that we probably would not at least as frequently on our own. Right.
Can I give a mini example of that?
Yeah.
Was when we did our, I don't even remember I'm terrible at remembering titles of series that we do, by the way. But when we walk through basically verse by verse, chapter by chapter, 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. Yeah. I mean, you talk about laying on a hand grenade. Like these are some of the most highly controversial verses in all of Scripture. And we said, no, we're going to walk through these chapters that are highly controversial, highly contentious, and we're going to seek to say, hey, what does this mean and how do we communicate it to our people?
Yeah, for sure. I think that it is valuable in making us confront things in the text. But what I would argue is that whether it's topical or verse by verse, book by book, is not the most important thing. It is whether it is textual or not. And that was a phrase that I was turned on to the more I studied Charles Spurgeon. Because the dirty secret of book by book expositional preaching is that most preachers throughout the history of the church have not done this.
Yeah.
The most famous and the earliest was probably John Chrysostom, who did it. But most, like the guys that we look back to as the heroes of the faith, and the Charles Spurgeon, the prince of preachers, Baptist of all Baptists, he would preach on a verse at a time and then jump here and there and so I think that the point was when Spurgeon preached on a verse, he was in the text of that verse and explained that verse. I think you can do that going through book by book, chapter by chapter, or topic. Are you in the text? Is the point of the text the point of the message? Where we lose that, to me, the opposite of that is sermons that proof text. Here's my idea. Here's 15 different verses pulled from 15 different places that
separate from their context.
That's right. And to be honest, I see that all the time in book by book, verse by verse preaching, because instead of dealing with the large chunk of the text and the big idea, we're going to read a verse that's going to give us an idea, and then we're going to go somewhere else. And I I sent this in Matt and I are in a group text with some friends, and I sent this TikTok in the group text yesterday. Preacher gets up and says, "My wife made pancakes this morning, and that got me thinking about the fruit of the Spirit. So that's why today we're going to talk about the importance of voting Republican."
Yeah, which was a live stream clip, I think.
It was. It's like, wow, that escalated quickly.
Pancakes to voting Republican.
And I think, though, as funny as that was, that is kind of what happens sometimes when we open a verse. It sparks a thought. That thought gets us back on our hobby horse, and then we go,
Yeah.
And so I think for me, the important thing is the text the point? Are our message textual? And I think that at the Orchard, we do a good job of saying, yes, even if we're doing a doctrinal series, which we're picking out one doctrine we're studying, during that week, we're going to unpack that text and that context that it's in and what it teaches us about that doctrine. I think a practical series where we're dealing with something far more practical, we do the same thing. I think one of the things that we have uncovered at the Orchard is there's probably value in variety, whether it is book by book, doctrinal topical, practical topical. As long as it's textual, there's probably variety in hopping between those. Yeah,
I think to give a vote, to throw a vote for the topical, there's a guy in Live Oak who, he may be the most well-attended guy that we have in Live Oak. He's there every Sunday. And the way that he got started coming to the Orchard was he was invited on Easter. He came Easter. On that particular Easter that he came, we were, foreshadowing the next series, which happened to be Scars on the Soul, where we talked about anxiety, addiction, and depression. And that resonated with him. He came back on his own the next Sunday, and he's been there ever since. Yeah. And so I think it's just that point of there is value in variety. We said in that Scars on the Soul series, I think we were honest I was probably most nervous about that because I'm like, I don't have a lot of experience here. I'm not a psychologist. I don't have a lot of expertise. And the Bible doesn't directly address a lot of those things. And yet the value is we saw statistically, these are huge issues in our society. So as followers of Jesus, how do we live in this society? What does the Bible say? And where can I find some sense of guidance and wisdom and even comfort if I or somebody I love is in this boat? Like, how do I deal with this? And so I think that's part of the value.
Dug into text that dealt with those, and it wasn't a surface, here's one. No, we dug into one of the Psalms of David, where David is struggling with this depression and anxiety of what's coming, and the context actually helps you understand it more.
Right. Yeah, I think it's you're not going to find a verse that says, hey, if you're struggling with addiction, then you need to meditate for 3 hours a day, take this particular prescribed medicine, and then in 6 weeks you'll be healed, right? Like it doesn't exist. And so it makes it hard. Honestly, I think, the criticism is, oh, well, topical's so easy and the hard work is exegetical. And I'm like, dude, that was hard. Because you're having to read research articles. You're having to read from experts in the field, from doctors and psychologists. And these are the facts surrounding these particular things we see arising in our society. And we're trying to say, okay, how as believers can we bring scripture to this to help meet this head on? How can we do this to minister to the people around us who may be struggling in these areas?
100%.
And so there's value in the variety, but that's hard work. To me, when I said the original question, what's the value of the book study? The content's already there. I'm not searching for how do you deal with addiction because I've never been addicted to anything. It's like, nope, this is Colossians chapter 2. I can read through it. If there's something that I'm, deliberating on, what does exactly this mean? I can read through 3 or 4 commentaries and I can kind of figure out, hey, this is what Paul meant. It's hard when you're like, hey, how do I talk to somebody who may be experiencing addiction and I never have? Like, I need to minister to this person. How do I do that? So
I think that's why there's value in that variety.
There is value in the variety.
And the way that we talk about it is up, in, and out, right? We have our up series, which are doctrinal series, they're book study series. We have our in series, which are more spiritual formation or practical Christian living series. And then we have our out series that are really just, we are unpacking the gospel and, calling people to salvation. And all of those are textual.
Yeah.
All of those are based in text. When you come to the orchard, we're going to open the word. We're going to stay in the word. We're not going to read a verse and then go on a discourse for 30 minutes, which again, that happens whether you're in a church that preaches topically or book by book far too often. Let me read a verse. Let me tell you my thoughts. I think the greatest crime in all of this is that the term exegetical and expositional has become synonymous with book by book, verse by verse, and they're not the same thing.
Yeah, I had a professor when I was at Liberty, and he was probably my favorite professor that I had, but he kind of provides some nuance to this, and he even pushed back against some of the, you have to go verse by verse. And his point was, I can be exegetical and preach the entire book of Jonah in one message.
Yep.
You know, because I understand the context. I understand what those verses mean in their context. And so I can summarize when necessary, and I can read and go through slowly those verses that are essential to the understanding of the book of Jonah. And so for me, it just kind of helped.
Well, it goes back to what you
clarify.
said early about sometimes it's summarizing, you know. All right. Well, we are, just like we do on Sundays, running out a little bit of time. So going back to Colossians specifically, because it was a book study, but it was not a verse by verse study. We were pulling that theme that Paul did about living on mission, the Christian life. Is there anything in Colossians that you wish we had gotten to talk about more than we did?
Absolutely. And I mentioned this. So I did the outline for this series.
Yeah.
We try to split those up. And so for me, this is very easy and obvious.
Well, because you were the one who was going through all of it.
I was the one wrestling with what do we have time and what is essential versus what do we have to cut out. For me, it's very obvious. I would go back if I could, and I would walk through chapter 1 because there's 2 sections that we did not go through verse by verse. And yet, to me, they're so theologically rich that I even said in our communicators meeting, I'm like, I'm putting this in the notes because I feel like we have to at least read this because I don't know how you leave this out.
Yeah, you can't leave it out, even though we don't have time to really stand on it and unpack it.
And I'll say the first one is this, and this has kind of changed my perspective a little bit. Every Saturday night of this series, this was my prayer specifically for the people in Live Oak because I was communicating to them, but for really everyone in our church and really all believers. But it's interesting because you don't always get a glimpse into the mind and the hearts of the biblical authors. One of the reasons I love the Psalms is because you do.
You do. That's what it is. Yeah.
Some of the things that David says, I'm like, David, I don't know if I would have said that, especially not
the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, especially not to the God of the universe, you know, or at least let that be your prayer time and not in your journal. And so one of the things that I think we get to see in Colossians chapter 1 is that Paul, you get to see his prayer for this church. He prays and he says, this is my prayer. So in Colossians chapter 1, verse 9, he says this, for this reason also, basically, I haven't seen you face to face. I didn't plant you as a church. All I did was hear about your faith. And I'm thanking God that I did. He says, since the day we heard this, we haven't stopped praying for you. And then he goes through and he says, and this specifically is what I'm praying. We're asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all wisdom and spiritual understanding, so that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him. Walk worthy of the Lord. You know what that means? It means as a follower of Jesus, you're living on mission. You are following Jesus. And so we're praying to aid you as you live on mission. We're praying to aid you as you walk with Jesus. And he says, well, we're praying that you would be filled with the knowledge of his will and all wisdom and spiritual understanding, that you would bear fruit in every good work and growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power. So now you're being filled, you're enabled and empowered to go and to live on mission according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience, because living on mission is hard. Like, we're praying for your endurance. We're praying that you would be patient. Paul's writing this in prison. And he's saying, I know it's hard to live on mission because I'm in prison because of it. So I'm praying for you because one day you might face those same things. And I'm praying that you will be able to endure.
He's talking to himself a little bit there too. You know, he's preaching to himself because he's experienced it.
And so, and he goes on, he continues, but I'm like, man, that is so theologically rich because we get to see Paul's heart and we get a glimpse into his mind. he says, this is my prayer for you. You are seeing exactly what Paul prayed for the Colossian church. And I would assume he prays for other churches as well.
Yeah.
And so for me, I would love to go back and just walk through that, exactly what that means. To me, it was so impactful that I started praying that every Saturday night. And I say, God, this is what I want for our people. I want them to grow in knowledge of you and your will. I want them to be able to walk in a manner worthy of you with endurance and patience and all of these things. And then the second one is right after that. If you've ever studied theology, specifically Christology, who Jesus is, man, I don't know how, and I struggled with this. I'm a theology guy at heart.
Yeah.
Chapter 1, verses 15 through 20.
That's where I was going.
I mean, Paul lays it out there. He says, this is who Jesus is. He's not just one of a lot of good religious teachers. Like, he is supreme. He is separate. He is Jesus. And he begins that verse 15. He is the image of the invisible God.
Man, we could just stop there.
Like right there, boom. You have a whole message. And here's why I say that's important, because theologically, Paul's laying out, no, this is who you belong to. This is Jesus. And like, respectfully, if anybody's listening to this, if you have friends who are Jehovah's Witnesses, they come to my house almost every Saturday. Like, this is what they're missing. And I'm like, you have some good intentions, but you're missing the best part of what it means to follow Jesus. You're missing Jesus.
Yeah.
He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. And then he goes on and he just lays out, man, this is who Jesus is. And I think I would love to go back through that, because
I think you could do a whole series on that Colossian hymn.
100%.
Right there. And that's what it is. It's a hymn. Like, you can see it's, if you got a hard copy of the scripture, even on your Bible app, you can see it's kind of offset, whatever. It's because it's a hymn. It's a psalm. It's so good. You could take forever and go through that. I agree. That's the one thing I wish we'd have got more time to spend in.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I wrestled with throughout the series anyway. So, definitely I would go back to those two.
Well, I think the series has been good. I think it's been helpful. I ended in Lake City yesterday by encouraging our people to get up, pray every day. God, open my eyes for the opportunities I have to talk about Jesus.
Yeah.
Help me see the opportunities that you're opening doors for me to talk about Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, where some of this begins, because that's kind of what Paul talks about. And I really think when we live that out, life is different, community is different, family's different, work is different, school is different, because it's that, we said this at the beginning, that lens of living as an informal missionary that you're filtering everything through. Yeah. And so if nothing else, I hope that people feel that call to live on mission, but that they also feel grounded and rooted in who Jesus is, so that they can live on mission.
Yeah. To me, yesterday, and I said this in Live Oak, chapter 4 was probably the message I was most looking forward to. Not because the other 3 were not impactful, but to me, chapter 4 is where it all kind of holds together. It's the nuts and the bolts. That's right. It's theologically, I can agree with all of weeks 1 through 3, but week 4 is almost this rubber meets the road moment. It's this look yourself in the mirror kind of moment and say, all right, am I committed to living on mission? Because if I'm committed to living on mission, there's an intentionality that comes with that. I don't just roll out of bed and say, I think I'm going to be living on mission today. And
that's right. Doesn't happen by accident.
No. Paul says specifically, he says, devote yourself to prayer. Now, yes, that is saying thanks, grace, whatever you call it, before you eat your lunch. But that is much more than that. It is an identity that I become someone who is rooted in prayer, and prayer is what anchors me to the mission. Prayer is what reminds me I'm on mission.
Yeah, prayer empowers me for the mission and anchors me to the mission. That was phenomenal.
And it enables me to stay alert. That's a big thing Paul says. He says in those first two, or that first verse, he says 2 things. He says, devote yourself to prayer and stay alert in it. So as you devote yourself to prayer, not only are you reminded I'm on mission, not only are you reminded I can't do this all by myself, you're also reminded because I'm on mission, I will face opposition. And so it enables you to stay alert.
Yeah.
And so to me, it was just the rubber meets the road moment. It was that, I think Prime Day, is it now or it's coming up?
I think it's coming. I think it's in July.
I don't know. I just saw something about it the other day, but I would assume that with all of the products on Amazon, if you're a Prime Day shopper, I would assume that you don't just start at the top and you just scroll through the countless thousands and thousands and thousands of deals out there.
So many deals.
Right.
Man,
I would
it's
assume
a commercial for Amazon right now. So many deals.
Yeah, unless they pay for my Prime. I would assume if you go shop on Amazon Prime that your first thing you're going to do is filter down the results.
That's right.
You're going to either search a keyword or you're going to go to a specific category of electronics or whatever you're looking for, and you're going to filter it down. And to me, chapter 4 and week 4 was the filtering down. It's
Look at it.
It's okay, there's 500,000 people in our surrounding counties who admittedly don't know Jesus. That seems insurmountable. How do I live on mission? I just go and pick a random one and I hope I'm one of the 500,000. Or you can filter it down. And Paul says this is how you filter it down. Number one, you devote yourself to prayer. And by devoting yourself to prayer, you're going to be anchored to the mission. But through that prayer, God will identify the people around you who are spiritually in need and hungry to hear. Like God will set those things up. You hear about them called divine appointments. But the reality is that divine appointment may be the same person you've worked with for the last 600 and something days.
Yeah, 100%.
And so,
in fact, that's what I love about what he said, at the end is to share with each person, because it's an individual thing. This is not a back up my dump truck of my gospel presentation sales pitch on as many.
Seems very pointed.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's just part of it. Chapter 4 was a rubber meets the road moment. It was a look yourself in the mirror kind of moment. It was a decision moment. But it was also like Paul's giving us the filters that you don't have to scroll through all the thousands of deals on Amazon Prime. You can filter it down through prayer, and you can filter it down by acting wisely toward outsiders, seizing the moment. That when you are gracious in your speech, it's like putting salt on the food. And the reality is that people who are hungry will find the salt. And so as you filter it down, it's through your everyday conversation, it's through your everyday speech. But if your speech is gracious, it's like being salted food. And then through those conversations, God, through the prayers that you've prayed, will identify those people. He will open those doors as Paul prays for. And then we have to be faithful to walk through the doors.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a good study. I think it is going to help shift that perspective, hopefully see some fruit in the future. And I teased in Lake City that starting in the fall, after school starts back, we're going to be launching into a whole nother series about, okay, what does it look like to actually share the gospel? Mm-hmm. When those doors are open and you've built a relationship, how do you actually share the gospel? And I'm excited to dig into that then.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think the goal for the series, having done it, I hope across all of our locations, I hope our people feel like, hey, I can do this. I can go and I can live on mission, because to me, it's really a confidence in who Jesus is, and it's a confidence in who you are in him. And that's the springboard that allows you to live on mission. And so that's my prayer. I pray that now we feel confident in who Jesus is. We feel confident that because of who Jesus is, this is who I am in him. And that becomes the launching pad that, no, we can do this. We can go and live on mission.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Let's Talk About That. I'm excited to keep some conversations going through the summer, and we'll catch you next week.
See you guys.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk About That. We hope it encouraged and challenged you as we continue to grow on this journey of faith and embrace community together. If you have any questions, thoughts, or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us through our social media channels or visit our website to stay connected. Your support is what makes this podcast impactful. If you found today's discussion meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, share the episode with a friend, and leave a review. Your engagement helps us spread the message and connect with others who can be encouraged through these conversations. Until next time, we hope this episode inspired you to live out your faith this week. Keep the conversations alive, and remember, we're all on this journey together.